And I will welcome up to the podium our next speaker and our guest artist, Bruce Dickey. Bruce.
Thank you, and good morning. I can't speak to you this morning as a scholar of Johannes Kepler, or as a scientist, or even as a historian of science. I want to simply speak to you as a musician, but a musician who has been quite unexpectedly touched by the legacy of this amazing man, Johannes Kepler. I'd like to say a few words about how that came about and what the consequences have been for me and my colleagues, hoping along the way not to misconstrue too much of the science. A few years back, I was asked by a major music festival in Belgium to make a proposal on the theme Cosmos. Now, I need to take a step back here and explain that I play the cornetto, a wind instrument with a cup-shaped mouthpiece like a brass instrument, but finger holes like a woodwind. This instrument, which I have spent the best part of my life trying to revive after its long period of obsolescence, was at the absolute height of its development during Kepler's lifetime. He will have had many occasions to hear it played in the musical sphere surrounding him in Württemberg, Tübingen, Graz, and above all in Prague. The cornetto was highly praised for its ability to imitate the human voice and played principally in churches, but also at court entertainments all over Europe, but especially in the axis between Venice, Vienna, and Prague. In my activity in reviving this instrument, I founded in the 1980s an ensemble called Concerto Palatino, comprised of a flexible mixture of wind and string instruments and voices. It was this group that the Belgian festival was interested in engaging on the theme of Cosmos. At first, I was a bit mystified how our instruments could relate to such a theme, since most of the music we play is based on Latin liturgical texts. After exploring a while on the internet, I bumped repeatedly into the figure of Johannes Kepler. Of course, like any reasonably educated person of my age, I was aware of him and his importance to the field of astronomy. I was aware that he was part of the rejection of the geocentric view of the solar system and knew he was somehow important in the development of the telescope. But my active knowledge ended about there. I began reading, and the more I read about him, the greater was my fascination and my awareness of his relevance to my musical world. Ultimately, my fascination led to a recording project and a couple of performances, but the project was deemed too expensive by the Belgian festival that initiated it. The CD carries the name of Nature's Secret Whispering, Music in the Cosmology of Johannes Kepler. And I make a little plug, it's available for purchase at the back of the room, along with some other CDs of Julie and other colleagues. In this CD, we attempted to reconstruct the musical soundscape of Kepler's world, combining composers with whom we knew Kepler was familiar and other composers working in his immediate environment, especially in Graz and Prague. Orlando Di Lasso, Andrea Gabrieli, Hans Leo Hassler, Annibale Perini, Lambert de Sèvres, and Erasmus Widmann. We also commissioned a composer, Calliope Zupacki, who is now the composer laureate of the Netherlands, to write a new piece inspired by Kepler's thinking. But let's return to Kepler and his musical background. Kepler was not a musician. He makes that clear at numerous points in his writings, as he defers to the practical musicians of his time. He makes no claims to mastery of the theory and practice of music. And yet, as the great 18th century music historian Charles Burney wrote, The great mathematician and astronomer Kepler, in his Harmonia Mundi, speaks upon the subject of music like a man who had not only thought of it as a science, subservient to the laws of calculation, but studied it as an elegant art and been truly sensible to its powers. As musicians, indeed as 21st century musicians, Kepler does not primarily speak to us from the realm of mathematics and astronomy. But as a man living in a troubled time, or perhaps I should say in a different troubled time, he was a deeply religious Protestant, living in a time of religious turmoil from which he would frequently suffer. He was a tireless defender of his mother against charges of witchcraft, while still believing, I understand, in the existence of witches. He was a defender of a new conception of the solar system, risking accusations of heresy. And above all, he was a man searching for harmony, a harmony that was badly lacking in the world around him. He found this harmony both in music and in the heavens, and expended a considerable amount of effort in demonstrating and explaining the relationship between these kinds of harmony. Kepler grew up in the musical traditions of Protestantism in Württemberg. From his 5th year, he studied German psalmody, as well as Latin sequences and hymns, which he later cites in his Harmonia Mundi. In addition to daily singing, there were weekly theory lessons. He would have studied counterpoint and figural music. It has been said that Kepler continued and deepened his musical studies in Tübingen during his theological studies. There, the academic ordinances prescribed singing 3 days a week, so that the students must always study new motets and good songs, and thus keep the exercise of music in practice. He also likely participated in performances of church music and in private festivities. So, encouraged by Kepler's sympathies and his respect for the practical side of music, I continued reading. Of course, no modern musician who has studied something of the history of his art can be unaware of the ancient concept of cosmic harmony, the music of the spheres, depicted so nicely on my T-shirt. It was universally believed that the planets in their movements produced tones, and Pythagoras, of course, demonstrated on the monochord the relationships between string length and pitch that solidified the relationship between mathematics and music. But what interested me more was how Kepler modified and in some cases abandoned these ancient ideas. Kepler rejected the idea that the movements of planets produced audible tones, since he reasoned that there was no medium in space by which these sounds could be transmitted. But nevertheless, his observations of planetary movement radically altered in his mind the nature of this celestial music. A lot of Kepler's reasoning about celestial harmony relies on the shapes of the planetary orbits, which he, of course, famously observed to be elliptical. If we relate the angular velocity of a planet's movement to a musical tone, a planet moving in a circular orbit, would produce only one tone. But if a planet moves in an elliptical orbit, its angular velocity will vary according to its distance from the Sun, moving most quickly at the closest point and most slowly at the furthest point. Thus, each planet, depending on the shape of its orbit, defined a unique musical interval by the proportion between its greatest and smallest angular velocities. And filling in the notes in between, a particular scale or mode as well. Thus, Mercury, whose orbit is the most elliptical, has the widest interval and most available tones, while Venus, as the most circular, sings only one tone. The Earth, nearly as circular, sings two tones a minor second apart, thus mi, fa, using the psalmization syllables of the time, causing it to sing its music in the Phrygian mode, which emphasizes this interval. Using Tycho's data, Kepler began to work with pairs of planets. He showed that the speed of Saturn at perihelion and Jupiter at aphelion were in the ratio of 1 to 2, corresponding to an octave. Similarly, the ratio between the speeds of Mars at perihelion and Earth at aphelion was 1:3, a perfect fifth, and so on. He reasoned that given an infinite span of time, each planet would occupy all possible relationships to the other planets, thus creating all of the harmonies heard in music. The miracle for Kepler was that this music would be polyphonic, composed of multiple sonorities superimposed one upon the other, and independently moving strands or melodies. But this music moved very slowly, billions, if not trillions of years for a cadence to occur, if one involves all of the planets. But man, he argued, whose mind was created in the image of God, in developing polyphonic music, created a parallel to the harmony of the spheres on a human scale. Thus, the most perfect polyphonic music was that in 6 parts, corresponding to the 6 planets known to him. This polyphonic music caused the celestial relationships and cadences to occur within a human span of time and caused it to be audible to the human ear. But at this point, a doubt crept into my mind. If you could convert these movements of the planets with their shifting angular velocities and the convergences of their harmonic proportions into sound, surely the result would be a constantly shifting series of glissandi, since the planets exhibit constant motion and not a series of discrete intervals. It would resemble an unbelievably slow motion series of siren-like undulations. There are some, I discovered, who have actually tried to produce such a music with computers and synthesizers. You can hear the result on YouTube. It is fascinating and eerie for a moment, and ultimately deadly boring, even though enormously speeded up. In my opinion, this sort of music would not have interested Kepler in the least. There is, in fact, a passage in the Harmony of the World where Kepler speaks of glissandi. He's trying to grapple with what distinguishes the calls to prayer of Muslim cantors and Gregorian chant. He determines that it is the intervals of the former which do not correspond to mathematical proportions, but even more, it is the glissandi which he finds to be barbaric. It strikes me that what Kepler was really trying to do was to find parallels in his observations of the heavens to the polyphonic music of the 16th century, which he so loved. In a certain sense, the music of Orlando di Lasso and others was his point of departure. It's my impression that the peace and harmony that Kepler found in listening to that music was a harmony he wished and finally succeeded in finding in the heavens. But this brings us back to the point which is most fascinating to me, the seeming tension between Kepler's scientific and mathematical reasoning about music and the intuition he developed in his practical experience with music. The amazing thing to me is that he seems time after time to defer to his practical experience and ultimately to his ear. In 1599, he wrote to a friend that he wished Orlando, if he lived, could teach him to tune a keyboard properly. Now, tuning a keyboard to a scientifically oriented astronomer would seem to me to be a question of measurement and mathematics. But he tells us that Orlando di Lasso, the ultimate practical musician, and not Pythagoras, would be the best person to teach him to tune his instrument. That is also because the tunings and temperaments used by practical musicians at the time went against the teachings of Pythagoras. Kepler confirmed that the most beautiful major and minor thirds and sixths were indeed not those defined in the proportions of Pythagoras, but those made possible by the deliberate mistuning of fifths and to favor pure thirds. How did Kepler make peace with the taste of his ear, which clearly clashed with the pure mathematics of his astronomical observations? Or did he? Could he have felt that peace and harmony on earth required compromise of a sort not found among the heavenly bodies? In trying to reconcile astronomical data and musical practice, Kepler displays a great deal of creativity, though I must say the results are not always totally convincing and can elicit a smile here and there. he makes the point that the planets are singing a polyphonic motet a la Orlando di Lasso. And he explicitly directs us to practical musicians, contemporary or just previous to him, in order to hear nature's secret whispering. Here is his most poetic rendering of this idea. Follow me, modern musicians, and attribute it to your arts, unknown to antiquity. In these last centuries, nature, always prodigal of herself, has at last brought forth, after an incubation of twice 1,000 years, you, the first true offprints of the universal whole. By your harmonizing of various voices and through your ears, she has whispered of herself as she is in her innermost bosom, to the human mind, most beloved daughter of God the Creator. In this cosmic motet, Kepler identifies the particular vocal part of each planet. The soprano is Mercury, with the largest melodic span. The Earth and Venus sing the alto with very narrow distances between their motions, as the alto, which is nearly always the highest in a narrow space. The tenor is sung by Mars, while Saturn and Jupiter, as basses, make harmonic leaps with few notes. Of special importance here is that, having escaped the geocentric cosmos, Earth is free not only to orbit the sun, but to sing its own song. This song of the Earth brings us to the other side of Kepler's reasoning on music, the importance of rhetoric. Kepler was not only interested in music as the human reflection of the proportions of heavenly bodies, nature's secret whispering, but as a student and teacher of the art of rhetoric, he recognizes that music must speak, communicate, and sing human passions. Thus, the song of the earth is determined by its narrow interval, the minor second, or stated in terms of psalmization syllables, mi, fa, mi. The earth, so full of pain and lamentation, sings, he tells us, of misery and famine, mi, fa, confronting the worlds of astronomical observation and musical rhetoric. One of the pieces of Lasso that Kepler cites in his comments on rhetoric is the five-voice motet In me Transierund. This was quite a famous piece already in Kepler's day and was famously analyzed in 1606 in terms of musical rhetorical devices by the theorist Joachim Burmeister. It seems likely from Kepler's remarks that he knew this analysis. Though the motet, being in 5 parts, fails to fulfill Kepler's ideal of 6-part polyphony, he seems to have been particularly moved by it. It is indeed a wonderful piece and features prominently both in our CD and on tonight's concert. Kepler is struck especially by the opening figure of an ascending minor sixth, resolving downwards by a minor second. This highly unusual melodic beginning for an imitative polyphonic motet powerfully evokes wailing. This quality of lamentation pervades the motet due to the prominence of the minor second, mi fa in its Phrygian mode, the song of the earth. So in the end, my fascination with the ideas of Johannes Kepler led me to explore a repertoire of music that must have inspired Kepler as well. Nature's secret whispering has touched all of us who were involved in it profoundly. I hope it will have moved others who have listened to the recording and that they will have found in it something of the peace and harmony Kepler professes to have found in it as well, and which he so wished to achieve on earth. Thank you. Any comments or questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, you were saying that his astronomical theories were putting him at risk of being accused of heresy, and it seems like at the time music would have often been performed in a religious context. Do you have any thoughts? Was he really inviting trouble by also bringing music into his theory of of the cosmos?
Bring it into the theory of the cosmos.
I mean, relating music to his sort of controversial theory, was he really risking ire? Because, I mean, the theory of the planetary motion has some theological bearing, but if taking this music that's used, to glorify God in religious contexts, and then saying that, and that's also a part of this new planetary theory, was that putting him at risk of further accusations of heresy?
Yes, I can't answer that really. But I mean, it does strike me that he says at one point he wishes God would free him of the bonds of astronomy so that he could attend what is his real goal, which is harmony on earth, and harmony on earth being both music, and he hopes to go beyond that and to in a political way to create some kind of harmony there. So I that's all I can offer on that.
Excellent talk, very interesting. I was particularly interested in your comments about different temperaments at the time.
Yes.
I assume that Kepler was sufficiently sophisticated in his musical training to know the mathematics of the different temperaments, and you said he was relying on Pythagorean temperament. Which was, if I understood you correctly, not the preferred temperament used by musicians at the time. And I guess I'd like you to comment on that. But also my question is, these were, in Kepler's analysis, these were intended to mimic vocal motets. And vocal music maybe had a little bit more flexibility as compared to instrumental music in terms of choice of temperament. So that's the question.
Well, I mean, I think Kepler was very well aware that musicians of his day pretty universally made use of mean tone temperament, quarter comma mean tone temperament, when a temperament is necessary. But temperament is something that applies to keyboard instruments. And if you have instruments like voices or trombones set free from a keyboard instrument, they even go beyond the mean tone temperament and try to achieve the closest thing to just tuning. And there are many, many theoretical discussions of how you fit together these different classifications of instruments. But I'm sure he would have been aware that no one in his day was using Pythagorean thirds. They were all using pure thirds, and he says that a number of times, that the ear requires the beauty of pure thirds. And if you understand anything about temperaments, you know that the only way to achieve pure thirds is by sacrificing the pure fifths. And so tuning, this is why he wants Orlando to tune his keyboard, because tuning a mean tone temperament is not a mathematical proposition. It's a question of listening to the fifth and making it just enough out of tune that you know the third will be pure, and then making them all sound the same. It's a very practical consideration. And he seemed to be very well aware of that and happy to accept the compromise that was necessary to achieve that kind of beautiful consonance.
Yes, thank you for that. I can't help but wonder if that problem of the mathematical perfection of the Pythagorean tuning and the oral perfection of the temperaments can again be chalked up to that problem he had with the cosmos of there being still some discrepancy even after he thought he'd solved it. But I have a different question. I wonder, we know what he thinks about the six-part voices and those kinds of music. I wonder if you can comment on what he might have thought about your own instrument, the cornetto, which would have been so popular at the time, I believe. Did he write anything, or do we have any idea if he was a fan or anything?
He didn't. I mean, he would have heard it everywhere at that time in that part of the world. He doesn't say much about instruments. He talks about vocal music. But, I mean, the cornetto was supposed to be the best imitator of the human voice, so he must have been inclined to accept that as well.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I was struck by what you said, how he was a deeply religious Protestant, and yet he's citing all of these mainly Catholic composers and Latin liturgical texts extolling Gregorian chant as opposed to other monophonic chants. And how do you think he reconciled that with his own faith, which was trying to install the vernacular as the liturgical language?
I mean, all of these composers, many of these composers wrote Catholic music and Protestant music, and Gregorian chant is at the as a building block of also many kinds of Protestant music. So I don't think there was a conflict with the Gregorian chant. I don't know about what he would have felt about Catholic music and whether that was a problem for him, but I don't have a better answer to that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.